This, in my view, is the most dangerous concept that shall be imposed in a formal way by WHO, and that is information control. This notion of controlling information is so against principles of democracy, and ultimately, it is a sabotage of the principle of informed consent. People will never come to informed consent without the full range of information that they shall be able to choose in order to have their capacity to judge. You will pick the wrong medication, you will pick the wrong doctor, the wrong treatment, if you do not have the right information. This is very simple.
This is a solutions event. This is what's happening.
After 5 successful events in North America, the Freedom Cell Network is partnering with Free Humanity to bring the People's Reset to Bath, UK.
The technocrats at the United Nations and the World Economic Forum are now hosting the Summit of the Future in New York City in September 2024.
Join us in September for the People's Reset UK, our summit for our future.
Over 3 days, we will gather in community, celebrating our victories and successes, whilst continuing to highlight solutions under 5 holistic themes.
Liberate your mind, body, and spirit.
Permaculture and food independence.
Building parallel networks.
Empowering technology.
And building free and conscious communities. 24 top-notch speakers, including Charles Dowding, Dan Astin-Gregory, Nigel Howlett, John and Rebecca Bush, and many more.
We'll also be hosting the People's Reset concert featuring international artist Dub.FX, as well as Presence, 33, and more talented performers to come. Join us for the People's Reset UK. Visit thegreaterreset.org to learn more and to get your ticket today. Is there a legal opportunity to derail the WHO's current proposals? I'm joined today by Zurich-based independent lawyer Philipp Kruse, who specializes in the fundamental rights and constitutional law. He's been very outspoken during the COVID pandemic and has worked on a major criminal complaint against the Swiss government agency responsible for the medical response to COVID. Now, during our road to Geneva, the Say No to the WHO campaign in May this year, culminating in the rally in June, I had the great pleasure of working alongside Philipp for the Road to Geneva and the We Are the Change rally and demonstrations against the latest power expansion by the World Health Organization. Now, he's one of several lawyers who have been advising on the Say No to the WHO campaign. He's been pivotal in driving legal challenges along the road. And ultimately, what's most important is he's translating the legal small print into something comprehensible so that we as ordinary humans can understand what exactly is going on. He was also one of the main speakers on the rally as part of the lawyers' press conference during the 77th meeting of the World Health Assembly, and also addressed over 200 demonstrators in front of the United Nations building on the 1st of June. Philipp Kruse, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Dan, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, it's great to see you again. But first of all, we have had little time to reflect other than our initial debrief from the rally. I'd love to hear first and foremost your take on the demonstrations and the events that took place in Geneva earlier this year. Those of us who attended the rallies in Geneva were, I think, realistic that our actions on the day would be unlikely to have a direct impact on the changes proposed by the WHO. But nevertheless, we felt compelled to show a strong sign of resistance. So tell me, what was your experience of these events, and what kind of impact do you think that the resistance movement has had on the proposals of the WHO?
That's a great question to ask. Dan, I take it from the visible. What was visible from the perspective of the audience, and most of all also from the perspective of WHO itself. It took place right in front of the headquarters of WHO, of the United Nations, where they held their World Health Assembly, this final date on 1st of June 2024. And so what we saw was a gathering together of literally the best experts from all of the world, at least I would say a huge number of the best experts from all of the world in these matters of WHO, mRNA vaccination, civil rights movement, the media as well, the alternative media, to speak out and to give a very educated immediate response of ultimately, no, we do not want that to happen. We know ourselves what is best for health. We are independent, and ultimately culminating in the Declaration of Independence in the name of literally all the nations on this globe and independence of WHO. That was a very powerful declaration. The entire setup of this rally and manifestation was very civilized, was very well organized. And just to make this happen, if you think of having 55 speakers from, I would guess, 20, 25 different countries, that in itself is logistically and from the organization, also from the communication, a huge professional effort. And I would say, from the perspective of the WHO, we delivered a very powerful and professional, unified response. And that was, for me, the most important success we made from all of these different countries, and then also coordinating all of that with an international small team, organizational team, where you were part of that, Andrea Nazarenko, Susie Olsen, and Maria Hugman-Mock, of course. So we made this happen and provided a very powerful, strong response to what in the same time happened at the World Health Assembly. Starting, of course, in the morning, you mentioned that, with a lawyers' press conference. 10 lawyers from 9 different countries provided their assessment on the latest developments within the WHO. It was necessary to provide this very strong response, united with people from literally all of the world.
Philip, I've got a question for you as a legal professional, and I think that component was vital because that happened in advance of the activist rally in the afternoon. And I think there's a fine balance between taking an activist stance and resisting against something whilst maintaining a professional, rational approach to the actual matters at hand, which is why I think the legal conference was so important, because it really sets out the practical, logistical elements that we must make sense of. How do you find that balancing that act, Philip, as a professional lawyer? How do you manage to retain that sense of professionalism in the face of such oppressive matters?
Wow. Again, a strong question then. That's actually tricky. That's the tricky part. And because of this being so critical, and people, in particular lawyers, do not like to be seen on the wrong side. Most lawyers prefer not to speak out. I think here we are, as lawyers, we are under the duty to inform the people in the best possible way so that they can understand what they are not informed about. So that forces me into the public. And of course, I try to do that in a most professional way I can do it, and side by side with the activists. And I'm sure that by doing so, we help keeping all of these activist movements going on in a very civilized manner. If we wouldn't do so as lawyers and leave the people by themselves with their anger, with their justified anger, I must say, we would probably see much more riots or negative energy on the streets. So we have to work hand in hand, the lawyers to inform the people, and that will then create the strength we need to oppose this. Ultimately, what it is, it's a power grab of the WHO over the nations, over the national states by these 2 new pandemic treaties.
Yes, we'll talk about the actual matters at hand in a moment, because it's so important we get an update on where things are. But on the point you've just raised, I was talking to one of my team this week, actually, and it's quite rare and unusual to have the kind of legal might that we've had as a freedom and human rights movement in its infancy, really, because we're dealing with issues that have stemmed since COVID, just in the last 4 years. So it's really vital that we have such professional, credible experts to work alongside us for the very reasons you've stated. Now, we've seen across the activist movement, there's been often fractured or politicized different views on the matters at hand. Have you found the same within the legal profession, or is there a kind of guiding consensus about the kind of state of reality right now?
Well, I would say from those lawyers who have understood the urgency and the dangers and the risks that are coming from the WHO's power developments, these new treaties, we have a very strong unity. What I can say is, of course, we have different perspectives and different levels of understanding, but I would never say we had a split or some difficulties to work together. No, we have to the opposite. We have a very strong sense of unity and work very well together across all the countries, whether it's United States, Europe, South Africa. We work very well together.
Thank you, Philip. I think I think we're very honoured to have such expertise alongside us here. So let's talk about the matters at hand. The pandemic treaty ultimately was not signed at the Health Assembly, but we've recently seen in the last weeks that the timetable has now been set and tabled for that process to be continued and completed. And unfortunately, the amendments to the international health regulations were adopted at the last hour. In fact, many hours after we'd actually completed our exercise in Geneva, an emergency meeting was held, and they got to the finish line. What's your take on what happened following our rally in Geneva in terms of the proposals, the WHO's amendments? What's the latest state of play with regards to those, the adoption of those amendments?
Yes, so as you correctly say, we have these two legal instruments, as the WHO calls it, the amendments to the international health regulations that were adopted, yes, on the 1st of June, under very difficult conditions and objectable conditions, I must say. And then the still to be agreed upon new pandemic treaty, which is a totally new treaty, and which the WHO decided ahead of the World Health Assembly, let's postpone this drafting and negotiation process to the period after the World Health Assembly. Now, with respect to the first one, the World Health Assembly, literally the Committee A, they tried to focus on the amendments to the international health regulations. And what we saw was actually they had on the 30th of May in the relevant Committee A vote upon the explicit request of Croatia. They said, we want to have a vote now on the amendments to the IHR. And we want to have an explicit vote. And the result of this vote was devastating. In this Committee A, which is the responsible committee, it was totally declined by a vast majority. It was ultimately sent back into the laboratory, into the negotiation room. So on the ordinary rules of the WHO itself, the procedural rules, there would have been no reason to come again and submit the IHR amendments again to vote. But then things got very shady. Under the leadership of the United States, the delegation of the United States, there took place hidden negotiations behind the scenes all the way of Thursday, all the way of Friday, into the morning of Saturday, 1st of June. And what then happened was really breathtaking. So on Saturday, 1st of June, there was the plenary session of the World Health Assembly, so literally everybody there. And in this plenary session, suddenly the chair said, now let's interrupt the plenary session and have the Committee A meet again on the amendments of the IHR, without any pre-announcement of that. So they interrupted the plenary session. They made the delegates for the Committee A enter the room again, and then that was very interesting. They didn't actually vote a second time on the amendments of the IHR, but what they did was just to say, is everybody okay if we transfer the amendments to the IHR directly into the plenary session? I hear no. I don't hear any no. Okay, so it is done. So without any second vote, as it would have been necessary to actually abolish the first vote of the 30th of May, the whole matter came directly into the plenary session to those delegates who had not dealt before with this matter. And again, it was submitted then to the plenary just by way of, we assume that everybody is all right with these amendments. We have had some very fruitful discussions in our IHR working group. So the delegates were under the illusion that there was a consensus. And then it was adopted without an explicit vote, without a head count, a count of votes. There was no such thing. They call it vote by consensus. If you look carefully at the procedural rules of the WHO, you find the procedural rules on the homepage of the WHO. You will not find such thing as vote by consensus. You find only the procedure which requires the exact specific count of votes in order to establish whether or not there is a simple majority. So 51%, you would need 51%. That was not done. This is where we stand. So of course, as lawyers, we object clearly to this violation of basic procedural rules. And we are talking here not about any kind of limited, let's say, administrative tiny regulation here. No, we are talking about most far-reaching rules that you could imagine determining the relations and legal obligations between the WHO and member states, including financial obligations. So you should expect to have this undergo the proper democratic process. Sorry for being so technical, but I have to say that was against the rules of WHO. And so that will be part of the lawyers' criticism against the adoption of these amendments that can be rejected, officially rejected, and must be rejected until 31st of March next year, 2025.
Yeah, so with that procedural failing, in the absence of any objection from any of the member states, does that effectively green light the amendments despite that procedural failing? So does it require an official objection from one of the nation states? Is it implicit that in their consensus or implied consensus that they accept the violation of that procedural necessity?
That's a good point. I mean, we could make the argument and say this adoption is null and void. We don't even need an objection or a rejection because of such a severe violation of procedural rules. But I would clearly recommend to politicians in all of the countries and to our community, let's work and move forward towards an explicit rejection, because the procedural rules also, I correct IHR, the International Health Regulations, Article 59, they say if we miss this objection, this rejection until 31st of March, then these amendments will become automatically the rule for every state, every signatory state of the IHR. And this is what we need to avoid for many additional reasons as well. I just mentioned the procedural problems, but we have huge issues that were clearly summarized in our lawyers' press conference. I just pick out one single aspect, which is of particular interest to people from the free media, from the media in general, and that is information control. You know, this notion of controlling information is so against principles of democracy, and ultimately, you know, it is a sabotage of the principle of informed consent. People will never come to informed consent without the full range of information that they shall be able to choose in order to have their capacity to judge. You will pick the wrong medication, you will pick the wrong doctor, the wrong treatment if you do not have the right information. This is very simple. The same goes also for the doctors. It goes for the decision makers in politics, and ultimately for the head of states. There should no such thing as an WHO-controlled world of information, and that we see in both of these legal instruments, in the amendments to the International Health Regulations, in the Annex 1, but also in Article 18 of the not yet adopted Pandemic Treaty. This, in my view, is the most dangerous concept that shall be imposed in a formal way by WHO. We all recall it is already in place under COVID-19. We see already now since 2020, a huge deal of information control, of censorship, censorship in all the social media, even on YouTube, all the other, whatever social media you have. And we see the self-censorship by the official media, who will never tell us that COVID-19 was not as dramatic as it was promoted by WHO, and who will never tell us that the real risks come from the mRNA experimental substances.
Yeah, I mean, Philip, you raise a lot of important points. And for me personally, my greatest concern about both of these proposals in many ways is they not only normalize what happened during COVID-19 without any recourse to review or independent scrutiny to learn the lessons. And if you just zoom out, and even if you're not a critic of what's going on, and just ask the question, should you give additional powers to an organization that has not yet been subject to any kind of review or scrutiny, you would normally say, absolutely not. We first need to look at, before we sign documents to say, yes, let's do this again next time this happens, or if this happens again, you would say, well, let's make sure we've learned the lessons, because quite frankly, the lessons are very clear by now, and they have been for much time. But these documents to me seem to not only normalize, but risk legitimizing and even legalizing the approach that we saw during COVID-19, not only in terms of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, lockdown, social distancing, masking, and all the rest, but also the precedent that was set around the pharmaceutical intervention, which has had its own series of consequences. So with that in mind, from a legal perspective, what do you think are the greatest ramifications, and has what I've asserted there, is that actually correct? What do you feel is the greatest ramifications of these proposals, these documents?
Well, you're absolutely right. And this was one of our main points in the press conference of the attorneys at law in the 1st of June. We said, well, before having done this clear after-action review, this reconsideration of all of the WHO's recommendations regarding non-medical and medical interventions and so on, we shall not grant this organization more powers and more financial means. Absolutely not. By doing so, what are the ramifications? Yes, the WHO will get more power, will get more financials, and most of all, it will get more discretion to have declared an emergency on the different titles much earlier and much longer than before. And as you rightfully mentioned, there is no mechanism of control. There's no mechanism of reassessment. So what we call checks and balances within our domestic legislation, there's no such thing with respect to WHO. When we bring this argument forward, then the official side tells us, well, yes, but there is the World Health Assembly. This is the big checks and balances. Well, have you seen within the World Health Assembly anything else but applause for the great leadership of the Director General, Tedros? No, this is not a meaningful way of correcting and reassessing the wrongdoings of WHO. So as long as we do not have done the homework with respect of a true reconsideration, reassessment, after action review of COVID-19, and as long as there is no such mechanism established for any future agreements, we must oppose these agreements. And in my view, this is a very logical argument to literally everybody on the street, because we do not have that in our culture, a concentration of power, of powers over all the people without any mechanism of, let's stop it now. Let's have a look at it, whether it is correct and justified or not, and without a mechanism of correction. We do not have that, whether it is in the civil society, in the business world, or in politics. So we shall never allow that to happen, because we cannot retake back again all of these powers into our national systems, which we need to protect our civil rights, our civil liberties.
Yes, well, as you were mentioning that, I think the lack of independent oversight and scrutiny is a fundamental problem. And even within the documents, as far as my understanding, the Director General himself actually gets to select the review committee.
Yes.
It to me, that's a bit like a defendant of a crime selecting the jury. You're clearly going to pick people that are favorable to your aims, and that's to your point on the WHA. So there is, the buck stops there. So there is no challenge, and the ability for people to challenge and member states to challenge is being eroded to some degree by these documents, which is quite frightening when you think about it in terms of the way we experienced COVID. And it's quite clear the lessons still haven't been learned, which I believe is of vital importance. I think fundamentally, absolutely, the person on the street, I think that's what they need to understand is, regardless of what you think about the WHO or any of these proposals, we have to take a step back before we take a step forward to say, well, hang on a minute, is anything that we did in the last 4 years actually applicable, relevant, efficacious? Does it work? What are the harms? What are the costs and benefits? But none of this has happened.
Absolutely. And we're not talking just about some academic principles. I mean, we are talking about a mechanism that will ultimately harm our health. It will harm our economies. It will harm the basis for our democracies. So, wow. My goodness, we shall exclude these kinds of risks. And the WHO was created in 1948 actually to reduce risks for health and also minimize risks for businesses. What they are doing and what they were doing in the past was they maximized the risks for our health and for democracies. So I think this is a very powerful message to the people. Do you want to have additional risks for your health and giving out of your hands the control over your body and also the control over the information that you get? Certainly no. So it is an instinctive rejection, in my view, that is needed by literally everybody. If you have understood what is here on the table, you must say no.
Yes. Well, no, a wider concern for me, Philip, is that over the last decade or so, the decision-making power within the WHO is somewhat been diluted by what I would describe as private and corporate interests. We've seen, obviously, the funding structure change from a member-funded organization to receiving private financials from the pharmaceutical industry, from NGOs that are supportive for the pharmaceutical industry. And this, for me, creates a conflict, in my view, in terms of how the WHO is structured and managed and financed. And, many of us have quoted that this is not about health. In fact, I think yourself have said similar, Philip, that this treaty is about creating a new pandemic industry. It feels like a pandemic industrial complex whereby we're actually looking for potential pathogens to create new drugs, treatments, preventatives, etc., to fuel a whole new industry. What do you think is ultimately motivating these proposals? It's all badged as for public safety and prevention, but what do you think? What in your view, what is really motivating this?
Yeah, absolutely. They have a great marketing machinery. They can pull all the strings to make us believe that it is all about health. As you correctly say, we have far over 80% of the financing is coming from discretionary contributions from the industry, the pandemic industry in the wider sense, but also from governments and from those powers who are interested in actually fostering this concept of pandemics. Ultimately, who is behind that? Well, of course, if you follow the money, you get some more answers. But also, we have to clearly view the connects. We see that in the United States, after anthrax, October 2001, we saw a growing sense of empowerment towards the Department of Defense, to defend the United States from any kind of bio-attacks. This psychological effect of September 11th and then anthrax was enormous on lawmakers, on the public as a whole. So people were willing to accept that the Department of Defense was given extra powers under the term of emergencies in case of a biological attack. And from that moment on, and I can just refer to the great presentations of Dr. David Martin and others who have pointed out that from that moment on, money literally was funded or funneled by Congress, always under the title of biodefense, and the laws were adjusted towards creating a biodefense industry. And if you look at these laws, you find the exact very same terminology that we see today in the EU Pandemic Treaty, in the IHR. You find this logic of emergency, you find this logic of One Health, you find this logic of whole of government, whole of society approach. That is an American concept. That is ultimately the military concept. If you are under a military attack, you have to hand over power to the military commander-in-chief, and he has then to make decisions without the possibility of checks and balances. In military, there's no such thing as judges and checks and balances. You want to avoid that. So all of this are concepts that have been, grown and promoted within United States jurisdiction, and have then been introduced with the powerful financial help of the industry into the World Health Organization that now shall promote this concept on a worldwide basis. So we have the industry working together, certainly with, I would say, powerhouses or organizations within the United States. And this is also probably the explanation why we have heard and why we see the finger and footprint of the delegation of the United States, of the Biden administration, all over the place. Right after the vote on 1st of June in the evening in Geneva, all the member states were allowed to give their statement after the vote was done. So the delegate from the United States literally said, well, we are proud. We have fostered the process. We were the ones to push for a revision, an amendment to the IHR, and we have pushed it forward in the year 2022 by shortening the periods for adoption and coming into force of the IHR amendments, and so on and so on. And we have heard literally from delegates on that very day, 1st of June, they were told by the members of the United States delegation, you are not going to leave Geneva before the adoption is done. So we not only speak about financial aspects here and business interests, this is also a huge geopolitical aspect here that comes from the United States, who wants to use and abuse the powers of the WHO to promote their view of biodefense.
Yeah, I think this is where things get really complex and most concerning for me, because I'm sure anyone listening to this, when you understand the mechanics of how these supranational organizations are working and the influences, because, it's all very well talking about private and commercial interests, but you've also got that interests of the major economies that have dominance over this. And of course, the WHO has been influenced heavily by the Chinese government in recent years as well, which creates this dominant effect over global health and more and beyond. And as you said, it's interconnected with other parts of the way that we live our lives. So increasingly, we're seeing this centralized approach with dominance of major powers. Yet here we are as the regular citizenry having to deal with these decisions without any democratic recourse. And when you hear stories like that, quite frankly, I'm just appalled and shocked. But it makes the puzzle even more complex, because I want to close out now by talking about what our challenge, what our options are. These documents, we've got the amendments that will automatically be adopted early 2025 without any objection from the nation states. And the members, we've also got this clear timeline for the treaty now. It hasn't passed, but again, with the same bullish nature, we know that this is going to get to the finish line in whatever form it takes. But quite clearly, we made an impact before. We've seen the chief negotiators talking about our rally. They've been talking about the classic misinformation that we're supposedly spreading. It's not to say that there hasn't been some factually inaccurate information circulating amongst the situation or over escalation of some of the terminology. But quite frankly, the issues that you've made clear are clear. And that's, again, why I believe it's important to have the legal professionals. But what options do you think are on the table for us, both legally and otherwise as a resistance movement to what's happening here for those who are concerned about what's happening?
Well, it's all about political pressure, and you can increase political pressure from the streets, but you can also, and we must, increase political pressure on the decision makers in the parliaments. And we still have some months to go. And these documents that are on the table are very, very telling. I mean, they are not easy to understand, but they are. You can convey the message, and you can find out that what we say and what we warn against is not a deception or not any kind of nightmare. It is a nightmare, but it is true. So we have to explain that to the politicians, what is on the table right now. It is a political process. We do not have a legal remedy, although personally I believe that we need to use the remedy of criminal complaints against those who were actually in charge of making disinformation, producing disinformation to the detriment of the people of the world. That will help to foster the political process. And this is what I've done in Switzerland with a criminal complaint against Swissmedic, as you mentioned. So it's a multiple layer movement and operation we have to push forward, where we need all of the players, pressure from the people and pressure from the members of parliament, the political decision makers, and of course, let's not forget about the media, where you are a great representative of the free media, Dan. And so all of together we can make it. And last point I want to mention is we needed to have this breakthrough after the 1st of June to reconsider and to carefully analyze the entire situation, to then come forward in August, late of August, with our strategy, with multiple papers in as many parliaments of the world as possible. And I am in contact with quite a few members of parliaments in many different countries. And what I hear is that now they get interested. They really get interested about, where is these, what are the WHO exactly these guys are doing with these two legal instruments. And they are about finally to understand the problem. And this is where my optimism comes from. We see a growing number of members of parliament. We see an international sovereignty coalition that by the week gets more and more members of parliament involved into these, information talks, which are ultimately transferred into political action. We see in the United States, meanwhile, 5 states who have sued Pfizer, and thereby making it very clear that these manufacturers have produced and delivered harmful products. Full stop. And so they went hand in hand with the World Health Organization. All of these are signals, positive signals. The last one I want to mention, just Germany, day before yesterday, you have probably heard of it, the publication, the leaking from a whistleblower of the documents, the protocols from the German Robert Koch Institute, which is the institute, the agency of the government, responsible for the proper risk assessment of any kind of epidemics, pandemics, and for the risk assessment of the medical countermeasures. And from these protocols, what we can see is that this institute did, at the beginning, they did a good job. They tried to calm down the politics and said it's not as dangerous, this COVID-19 thing, as you say, but watch out. The countermeasures are the dangerous part here. And we see from the protocols that it was the politics who tried and ultimately successfully manipulated this institute to ultimately push forward the political narrative. So this is now in plain sight, a couple of thousand pages where we can read in these protocols where the influence came from. So all of this must be used to increase political pressure for the people to wake up and for the politicians to act, to ultimately say no to these two treaties.
Yes, but I think this year is a fundamentally important year. 2024, there is 49% of the world's countries are going through an electoral cycle this year. So the political landscape is going to radically change. It's already changing here in the UK. And, I could say not necessarily favorably, but that's my personal opinion. But nonetheless, there is change. Now, that presents some disadvantages on the front that the people culpable during COVID-19, and certainly if we look at the kind of political makeup of the current parliament in the United Kingdom, many of the people who I would say are responsible for what happened during COVID are no longer in power. So actually holding them to account becomes, I think, more difficult. But on the flip side, the opportunity and the advantages that we have seen a realignment of the political system, and there are new faces and new voices in Parliament who have not been subjected to this type of information. And I think that does present opportunities. And I think there is, in some ways, in the political landscape, there is a pushback against the overall trajectory that this world has been on in the last few years, and I think that represents an opportunity. There are new faces, new voices that we must connect with to help to get this message out there, Philip. So I think there is political opportunities in this year, and I think for those countries like the United States, for instance, that are on the road to a political election, then this topic has to be kept on the agenda. It's surprising. It's not surprising, but quite frankly, but in the electoral cycle in the UK, COVID wasn't even on the agenda. No one spoke about it. Only people who have been already against what happened during the last couple of years. And in America, it's not making it onto the political discussion. It's been brushed under the carpet, which ultimately is the ultimate sign of where we are, but we have to push forward to actually continue this conversation so that this does not happen again, because in my view, as I've already stated, these documents will risk this happening again. And as David Bell recently said on this show, this whole argument is predicated that they keep making the same argument that the next pandemic is just around the corner, like it's the boogeyman hiding in the cupboard ready to spring out at any time, whereas statistically that is false unless there is another form of gain of function led, and again that's a whole hot topic of discussion, but whether there is a natural or artificial threat, the point is this tool creates the possibility for the definition of an emergency to be stretched in all manner of ways. So in my view, Philip, we really have to take political action, and that's why I love the way you said all the players need to step up now. We've got a clear timeline. The WHO has set out their timeline, and we know how long we've got to resist the adoption of the IHR, and we also know the timetable for the treaty. So I think it's time to galvanize now. The challenge, as always, we're not in the COVID phase now. We haven't got the in-your-face tyranny of lockdowns and mandates and restrictions. So it really takes, real focus in the face of that to do what's right for the long term.
Absolutely. But it might be quickly back with the bird flu that is pushed so much and heated up in the United States already. They will try that to do the same here in Europe by telling us stories like, oh, well, the bird flu has jumped onto the cattle, so let's kill the cattle, let's kill the birds. All of this might help, making people suspicious about exactly what you're mentioning. Well, again, statistically, how comes that we have such high number of pandemics for such a long period? This cannot be, There must be something behind that, gain of function, the self-production of these viruses, supposedly for defense purposes. All of that must be addressed directly. We see at the horizon, Trump, if he will become elected, he has announced clearly that he would stop immediately these treaties. He would stop funding. He even said he would exit the WHO. Well, it's difficult for me to believe, but it's a strong signal at least. And in the UK, we have Nigel Farage, who wants to Brexit the WHO, an encouraging man. He has managed to do the Brexit from the EU. And I can well imagine he is capable. He is a very good leader, has a strong sense of good humor as well, that he will manage to bring up this topic at least into the mainstream media, to the attention of the people. So yes, there are we are not the only ones to push forward. I wanted to say,
yes,
we are not alone. Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, I mean, I think it's encouraging that there are politicians who are willing to take the battle on, although I remain completely skeptical of any political interest in this matter now. It's just my hopes have been raised far too many times in my adult lifetime to recognize that,
absolutely.
Actually, the moment we start to feel like there's someone in Parliament that's going to take care of this, that we start to let go of the rope. And that's part, in my view, it's part of the problem that we face today, is that the public have let go of the rope, and we must look ourselves in the mirror and recognize that where we are today isn't an overnight situation. It's a long slide and concession of our own power and democratic power. So it's not just addressing these documents. I think we have to reassert our right as citizens on domestic, local, and international affairs, so that these people in power don't continue to, take advantage of situations for profit and power.
Yes, and it's a very rough field. I mean, we have seen what happened to Andrew Bridgen. Andrew Bridgen, as a member of the British Parliament, he has done such a great job in informing people and speaking out for the people's freedoms in the interest of the people. He was the true representative and spokesman of the interests of the British people. And he, I cannot believe that he was not re-elected, and he just got something like 1,600 votes from his constituency. So this is, for me, highly questionable. And I hope Andrew I consider him a very good friend. I hope he will continue his honorable and great battle. And of course, I would anytime support Andrew and everybody who is with him into this fight for freedom.
Absolutely. I just want to close, Philip, by asking you, what are your next steps? What are you working on now, and at least what you can share publicly?
What I can share public, of course, I will share my analysis of the IHR amendments in a wider circle. I've done that already with a smaller circle of Swiss regional members of parliament, Canton of Thurgau. We have had a nice parliamentary debate about the problems of WHO already. It was, for Swiss circumstances, spectacular. So I want to reproduce that on an international level, make this analysis available to all the politicians, to strengthen their back, to give them the necessary arguments. So this is what I can tell about. Of course, also I will travel if necessary and help them directly in their country. The other project, I cannot tell you more about that, but you can imagine in which direction I have to work if you consider what I have done in the past. So I can ensure you I will continue these efforts ultimately to educate people. It's all about educate people and to giving them the full truth so that the people can make the right decisions.
Thank you, Philip. Keep up the great work, and more to come on this matter. There's work to be done at Free Humanity as well. We're working on next steps. We've got our open letter currently active, which you can sign in the comments. Look that up there. Add your signature to that. We've got over 10,000 signatories in the recent weeks, so please add your name to that. And we've got more to come. So watch this space. Thanks again, Philip. It's great to have you here, and undoubtedly we'll have you back as things develop.
Thank you so much, Jan, for your great work. You're doing a great work, and it's a pleasure to be here.
This is a solutions event. This is what's happening.
After 5 successful events in North America, the Freedom Cell Network is partnering with Free Humanity to bring the People's Reset to Bath, UK.
The technocrats at the United Nations and the World Economic Forum are now hosting the Summit of the Future in New York City in September 2024.
Join us in September for the People's Reset UK, our summit for our future.
Over 3 days, we will gather in community, celebrating our victories and successes, whilst continuing to highlight solutions under 5 holistic themes.
Liberate your mind, body, and spirit.
Permaculture and food independence.
Building parallel networks.
Empowering technology.
And building free and conscious communities. 24 top-notch speakers, including Charles Dowding, Dan Astin-Gregory, Nigel Howlett, John and Rebecca Bush, and many more.
We'll also be hosting the People's Reset concert featuring international artist WFX, as well as Presence, 33, and more talented performers to come. Join us for the People's Reset UK. Visit thegreaterreset.org to learn more and to get your ticket today.